Welcome to In Court, the podcast where we delve into the trials and tribulations of the courtroom. My name is Nina Tornquist and I'm a criminologist at Uppsala University in Sweden. My research centers on the worlds of the legal professionals, with a particular focus on emotion and legal decision-making. I have observed criminal court cases in Sweden for almost a decade.
My name is Chloe Squires, and I'm a PhD researcher at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. My work looks at the sentencing of individuals charged with terrorism offences, and I'm observing court proceedings in England and Wales.
My name is Nicole Bögelein. I am a sociologist and criminologist at the University of Cologne, Germany. My work focuses on institutional racism in court and terrorism cases. For several months, I have observed courtroom hearings on low-level offences in German district courts. In this podcast, we dive into complexities we have identified throughout our times observing legal proceedings to demystify what happens in the courtroom. We are going to talk about agency today because this is one of your research focuses, Chloe. I feel like this is a concept that's really hard to grasp. Could you give us a simple answer to the question, what is agency?
Thanks, Nicole. Agency is somewhat of a subjective term, you're right, and it has a number of different definitions. Existing conceptualizations of agency differ across terrorism studies, international relations, criminology, etc., but they tend to describe agency in broad terms as relating to decision making, action, and structural enablers or inhibitors. For example, the choices available to the individual are dependent on other external factors such as age, sex, gender, location, and other broad societal factors. The definition which I favour is behaviours in which a person chooses to engage in order to shape his or her experiences within social structures in sight of his or her understanding of the social structures that surround and constrain his or her options. That definition comes from Greason and Campbell and is based on the definition from Messerschmitt.
Thank you very much, Chloe. I think that's a very good explanation of how the academic way of defining it works. To be honest, I still struggle. Could you be so kind and maybe explain it by using a case that makes it a bit more down to earth, maybe?
Definitely. An example which I think illustrates agency and the complexities of agency is that of Shamima Begum. Now, this is a very famous case in the UK context. In 2015, Shamima Begum and two of her school friends left the UK to join the so-called Islamic State Caliphate. At the time of departure from the UK, Shamima was 15 years old. For many, she was considered a child and was portrayed as having been groomed into joining ISIS. In 2019, Shamima Begum was discovered to be living in a camp by Times journalist. By this time, she was pregnant, having already lost two of her children. She had been married to an ISIS fighter and had asked to come home in order to give her baby the best chance of survival. Shamima Begum gave an interview to the Times in which she detailed some of the experiences she'd had and having seen heads discarded in bins and other awful things that she'd experienced. Shortly afterwards, the narrative around Shamima changed quite drastically, and she became portrayed as monstrous, wicked, and a security threat who should not be brought back to the UK. Shortly after giving birth, a journalist handed Shamima Begum a letter from the Home Secretary, and while being recorded on national news, Shamima read the letter, which detailed not only would she not be permitted to return home to the UK, but her citizenship would be revoked on the grounds of national security. The Home Secretary at the time revoked her citizenship and left her essentially stateless, and at the point of recording, that's how she remains. Her baby died shortly afterward. Many of the discussions surrounding Shamima Begum in media, academia, and governmental spheres, and even in the general public, centered on her agency and how much of a security threat she should be considered. Many suggested she was groomed, that she was a child, and others claimed that she had made decisions to leave the country and fight against the values of the UK, and therefore she should not be allowed back to the UK. For many academics in terrorism studies and criminology, these narratives are classic agency-reducing narratives. Does that help, Nicole?
If I can translate it maybe to a more everyday language, the word equals how someone is depicted or perceived as someone who's actually able to do things in their lives and to decide on things, and not so much depicted as a person to whom things just happen. Does that sound about right?
Definitely. I think agency has a lot to do with responsibility, intention, and how somebody can be portrayed to have displayed intention and responsibility over their actions and the choices that they made.
Yeah, and drawing on your discussion, I think that for me, agency is also really about self-determination and how that either can be something that we see as very individualized or very structural. My question for you, Chloe, kind of touches upon that. So the Shamima case made me think about a rather consistent finding in criminological research that shows that women are treated more leniently in criminal justice system, and that this finding is understood as a result of gendered stereotypes, downplaying women's autonomy. However, if we look at racialized stereotypes in court research, they also undermine agency in many ways. But here research shows that racialized persons receive harsher sentences. So I was thinking, do you have any thoughts about these curious and somewhat contradicting results? So for me, the Shamima case also really puts this finding to its head, in the sense that Shamima being both racialized and a woman. So otherwise the findings are either looking at white women or men of color. So the Shamima case raises the question about intersectionality and made me wonder what happens when you look at how the agency of a racialized woman is interpreted. I was thinking, Chloe, do you have any thoughts on this curious and somewhat contradicting result? For me, it seems like the question of parenthood must be crucial in some way.
Thanks, Nina. You're right in that this is a really complex process to analyse, and there are lots of different factors which can impact the sentencing of defendants, and that does definitely include race. My research has focused on gender in sentencing decisions, and throughout my PhD, I've found some pretty surprising elements. For example, references to vulnerability and mental health were dealt with pretty equally for male and female defendants in the cases that I analysed. For example, for female defendants, factors such as having a child and broader considerations around the impact that prison has on women played a significant role in the sentencing of female defendants, but not for male defendants. So, as you point out, parenthood does seem to play quite an important role. So, in regard to the racialized elements of the data, I can't really comment, as race or ideology were not factors which could clearly be delineated in the data that I used in my PhD. Nicole might be able to offer some more insights here, though.
Well, what I can say from courtroom research on racism in court is definitely that US American studies show how people who are racialized in certain contexts are ascribed more agency, which means they're made more responsible for their offenses. So, an example I can give is how courts consider addiction and psychological issues. We can see that for white offenders, that is often taken as an excusing factor, as something that explains how things happened. And for people who are racialized, courts tend to take that less into consideration as a factor that actually mitigates their agency, but it's just noticed but not really taken into account. So, yeah, I think what studies would tell us is that often agency is an issue that's an aggravating factor when you are tried and sentences are being imposed. And what we see is that racialized people are ascribed more agency, which might be one of the factors that leads to the standing empirical research finding that they receive harsher sentences. So, what we see is that agency is not established on a blank piece of paper. Sex, gender, and race will play a role. Could you go into details, Chloe, on what we know about how agency and certain other factors are actually intertwined?
Definitely. And this is where things get quite complicated. For me, and this might differ for others, I think agency is entwined with structural factors, which may be dictated or influenced by different factors such as gender, race, or age, socioeconomic background, for example. So, the degree of agency that women have in their home or workplace or society can depend on factors which relate to other factors such as religion and cultural expectations. So the choices, decisions, and options available to individuals are enabled and constrained by different structural factors. So while gendered structures can organise the agency which is available to women, the work of Gina Vale demonstrates that this is not only between gender, but within gender. So intragendered structures also enable and constrain the behaviour and actions of women. For example, in ISIS, some women were married to ISIS fighters and may not have had much agency outside of the home, for example. But within the home, these same women may have made decisions about the enslavement of Yazidi women, for example. It's also important to highlight that agency is not static and it changes depending on different locations. And for example, I've heard Catherine Brown talk on the notion of complex agency, in which she points out that agency can be different, for example, inside and outside the home. And this is particularly pertinent in the example of Shamima Begum, who traversed different cultural norms and different structures as she travelled from the UK to the Caliphate. So hope that answers your question, Nicole.
It does. Thank you very much.
So, hearing you talk about agency, Chloe, I think that while our everyday understanding of agency serves as this kind of underlying filter that shapes our interpretation of all kinds of actions, not only criminal acts, agency is also a concept that is difficult to tie to concrete empirical examples. Can you tell us how you have gone about your study methodologically?
Thanks, Nina. This is definitely something I wrestled with for a while, and I have come to the conclusion that agency is difficult to observe because it is always filtered through lenses of understanding. For example, if I observed your own behaviour, Nina, I would make a decision on the degree of your agency based on my own understanding of agency. If I observed the way that judges talk about the agency of defendants, I am making a judgment on the opinion of the judge's opinion, both of which are rooted in our own understandings of agency. So it's complicated. We also do not know that the individual in question represents their level of agency accurately for several reasons, which might include the wish to deceive and the hope for a lower sentence, or factors relating to trauma, which can distort the individual's perspective on their behaviours. So we can't truly know the degree of agency someone has, and this is a big methodological challenge. However, what we can observe slightly more clearly is the link between the judge's perception of the defendant's agency and the role that this plays in sentencing decisions. So I've used a framework based on linguistics to help understand the way that judges position the agency of defendants and the language used to amplify or reduce the agency of the defendant. This is typically done, as I've seen, by using the active voice or the passive voice. For example, there's a difference in a judge stating you downloaded terrorist material to your phone versus terrorist material was found to be downloaded on your phone. However, a further problem here is inferring the degree to which this factor impacts the sentencing of defendants. So overall, it is very complicated.
To make it a bit more complicated, Chloe, we are still in a podcast that's called In Court. So we basically are not here to just understand agency by the means of understanding agencies, but we really want to understand what role agency plays in a courtroom. I guess I've already given some indication when I spoke about the connection between racialization and agency, but still, I'll ask the question to you. Why do we talk about agency in an in-court podcast? I guess it has to do with the connection of culpability and agency, but can you please explain how these two go together?
Thanks, Nicole. This is a great question. So I come from an international relations background. So language which relates to culpability, capacity, etc., are not totally familiar to me, not because the terminology is unfamiliar, but because these are terms which are linked to broader legal processes, which, as a non-legal scholar, I am not totally familiar with. However, particularly in recent years, growing numbers of researchers without a legal background, such as myself, have become interested in legal processes surrounding terrorism suspects, partly due to cases such as Shamima Begum, and partly due to governments being confronted with issues of how to respond to their citizens who left to join the ISIS caliphate and wishing to return home, and other numerous issues. So, in order to enable interdisciplinary research of the space and encourage socio-legal scrutiny of the legal framework and processes which unfold in the courtroom, I think there is an argument to build frameworks which reduce linguistic barriers for non-legal researchers. For example, the United Nations Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate situate agency as a process which impacts the sentencing of defendants. I quote, "Women tend to receive more lenient treatment in the criminal justice system based on often false gendered assumptions about their limited agency." End quote. We need to build language which bridges different disciplines which can contribute to understand these claims. And I argue that by focusing on the role of intention, we can create common ground between agency and culpability, which, even if not fully operational in the courtroom, opens avenues for socio-legal researchers to work in the space.
So I think it's great to stay a little bit longer in the courtroom. And do you think that there are differences between how the defense lawyers build their defense, depending on the gender of their client? And have you seen any commonsensical arguments in your data that is only used for female or male defendants?
Thanks, Nina. As I noted earlier, the most common narratives relate to having children and women being considered to have a more difficult time in prison. Now, in the UK, we have a governmental priority called the Female Offending Strategy, which highlights the impact that imprisonment has on women, their children, their communities, and their wider life trajectory. For example, children are more likely to go into care if their mother is in prison, and women are typically imprisoned over 60 miles away from their families and encounter more acute issues with housing and jobs. Part of the reason that women are in prison so far away is because there are more limited facilities to house women in prison, for example. Women are also more commonly imprisoned for under 12 months due to committing less serious offences, and this often means that women face these difficulties without any real rehabilitative benefit, which prison can, in theory, provide. But other factors, such as mental health and vulnerabilities, are more equally observed for male and female defendants. However, agency reducing narratives around being groomed and being influenced by others are more commonly seen for female defendants. But maybe unlike the literature more broadly suggests, these factors do not play a significant role on the cases which I have analysed. More commonly, judges were more likely to point out that female defendants knew what they were doing and were not as naive as they pretended to be. I would be interested to understand how juries interpret evidence put forward in the case and the arguments made by different actors in the court, and how these different types of evidence are accepted or rejected by the jury, for example. But in the UK, we're not able to research the jury. Nina, I think this might be slightly different in the Swedish context.
Yeah, so actually, in my previous research projects, we have been able to observe the deliberations in Sweden. So that has been both in district courts and in appellate courts. However, we haven't studied their interpretation of gender and agency, but more have looked into the interactional dynamics of legal decision making and how different emotions play a part in these interactions. But I will definitely go and look through my data and see if I have something that we can discuss later on.
I really hate to end this really interesting discussion, but we could talk about this for hours, and we plan to have more episodes in the podcast, and I'm sure we'll pick up this topic again. But for today, we come to an end, and that's it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. Bis zum nächsten Mal.
Speak to you soon.
Vi hörs!